Although rumors of impending conflict with Great Britain had been circulating for months, the actual outbreak of hostilities in 1775 finds the colonies unprepared for the challenges of armed conflict. The loosely formed confederation is less than a third the size of Great Britain and cannot begin to match its economic and military strength.
By the mid-1770s, a growing number of Americans are aware of the various constitutional disputes that are taking place and are angry with what the imperial authorities are allegedly trying to do.
The great promoters of revolutionary activity in Virginia are the planters. Many of them were deeply indebted because the marketing system for tobacco was focused on a factor system, a middleman system, which meant a great deal of profits and a great deal of influence was drained off to English and especially Scottish factors. If you looked at Massachusetts, a prominent group in support of the revolution would be merchants who were very active, say, in the West Indian trade. So strict customs regulations were not always in their interest. People who had political ambitions that would always be thwarted if ultimate authority lay with the crown. There would always be certain barriers in a system in which the best perquisites, the best appointments, the plum patronage jobs rested with the crown. And the revolution often seems to present an opportunity for them to talk about the rights of man, to talk about equality, to talk about reforming a society in such a way that they will have a point of entry that seemed closed off to them.
The difficulty that we often get into in this is to think that the movement itself was so wholly the work of several dozen people. It had a population of 2.5 million people behind it, or accepting the slave population, which was about 400,000 or 500,000 at the time. And there were people behind it who engaged in it reluctantly. Some did not engage in it at all. Some who resented the revolutionary movement. At least 60,000 of this small population were displaced as loyalists, not because they did not share the ideas, but because they drew different conclusions from them and thought that it was an unnecessary disruption of a successful empire. So it's a complicated picture.
In Britain, there's uncertainty as well, but of a different sort.
There was no sense in Britain that there was a powerful flow of ideas, of ideology that was building up through this period, that they had to think of in larger terms than just a bunch of malcontents here and there to be broken up and put down. But as the movement grew, and as support for them also grew in England itself, then there was a point reached at which they could have seen the deeper pressures and implications of all of this and failed to.
To a large degree, support for independence in the colonies intensifies when a pamphlet written by Thomas Paine, simply called Common Sense, begins to circulate.
Paine said, a monarchy is a ridiculous system of governance. Why should anyone think that the idiot son of someone in charge should be our ruler? He said it was absurd that an island should govern a continent.
The pamphlet was written by Paine to be read aloud in taverns and public places so that even if you weren't literate, you would be able to know about common sense. And if you read it aloud, it sounds exactly like a sermon, like a Republican sermon.
So he completely overturned the assumptions and the long-cherished beliefs. And that was a turning point in terms of political thinking and in terms of cultural identity, how Americans saw themselves.
3 weeks after the battles of Lexington and Concord, the Second Continental Congress meets at the State House in Philadelphia with delegates from every colony except Georgia.
From 1775, when war broke out, until 1778, the assumption of any informed person, including many Americans, was that Britain could not lose this war. They were the greatest military power in Europe, and they had all sorts of resources they could draw on.
The basis for the authority of the Second Continental Congress is, at least in the early years, that it provides legitimacy for the whole resistance movement. And in that process, it begins to absorb most of the functions of the Crown in America. more as a plural executive rather than legislature.
As Congress moves slowly toward a final break with England, it appoints a committee to draft a formal Declaration of Independence. Thomas Jefferson, the young delegate from Virginia, drafts the initial document.
Jefferson first played an important role in the Virginia House of Burgesses, and he did so through his writing. He wrote an incendiary pamphlet. It was published as a pamphlet called The Summary View of the Rights of British America, in which, this is in 1774, he set out in a very bold and forthright way some of the advanced radical positions, and most scholars read the Summary View as a rehearsal for the Declaration of Independence.
The committee and then the Congress, of course, took this draft and did what any committee does to something, which is hack it to pieces. And the story goes that Jefferson was very upset by this, and Franklin said, once there was a hat maker, and a hat maker designed a sign to go in front of his shop, and he had a picture of a hat, and he had the words, John Smith makes fine hats. By the time the committee had gotten through with it, each one of the words had been excised. So Franklin said to Jefferson, you just have to relax. This is the way it is. The sign ends up with a hat, that's the essential point, and the Declaration of Independence conveys the central ideas.
John Dickinson of Pennsylvania thinks it's mad, by the way, to declare independence without having some kind of, if you like, constitution for the United States of America. So he refuses to sign the Declaration of Independence, but remains in Congress and works on the Articles of Confederation. And it takes them almost a year and a half to draft something which can be approved by Congress. Without going through all the details of that drafting process, it's interesting first that there's no public debate about all of this. Americans are arguing passionately about what the government of Massachusetts should be or the government of Virginia should be. They are not arguing about what the United States should look like.
The American provinces had very little to do with each other under the British Empire. Only neighbors would have certain arrangements, but by and large, the primary relationship was between each province and Britain. And so the American provinces, which had no experiences of governing themselves in foreign policy particularly, suddenly faced a challenge very much like the challenge that a group of independent nations would face. The reason why the Articles of Confederation is based on the premise of one vote for each state is that in a strict sense all states are equal, and it doesn't matter that some are bigger than others. Of course, this was a sore point from the beginning in debates about taxation and debates about contributions to the war. A loose alliance of semi-sovereign states was the only way to go at this time.
Carl Becker, I think, said that there were two questions in the American Revolution. The first question was gaining home rule, and then the second question was who would rule at home. And even during the Revolution, and certainly after the Revolution, you see lots of disputes and fights within colonies and different interests at work.
Many enthusiastic patriots believed that without the British connection and as independent, self-governing republics, the American states would have no occasion for conflict among themselves, and that union would be spontaneous. That is, because everybody was participating in a common effort, the common cause as it was called, and because we, all Americans, were devoted to these common principles of liberty and self-government, then it wouldn't be necessary to have a strong central government. Meanwhile, of course, during the Revolution, while the war was on, the Continental Army provided a kind of a cohering force, and Congress actually performed under the circumstances remarkably well in provisioning the Army and sustaining the war effort. But that kind of loose union could not possibly survive the peace.
The new governments of both the states as well as the nation face enormous challenges as they mobilize for war. The first order of business is recruiting and organizing an army.
Usually they volunteer because they're recruited by some local figure who's well known. Often you get multiple relatives, couple brothers, something like that. But what does seem to have stimulated them, this varies from year to year, even within a war, but they're paid better wages than redcoats. And often, if they're not getting enough volunteers, they're given bounties to enlist.
As the war goes on, the Patriot group grows, though it's always a real struggle for the Patriot leaders to get people to sort of sign up and go and fight for the war.
Military service in a war is a one-campaign affair. So you recruit somebody in the spring and they want to go home in November, and then the next year you recruit a new army.
And in fact, ironically, the army, the Continental Army that's fighting the War of Independence, more and more consists of people from the least advantaged part of American society. I mean, the war for property and freedom and liberty is fought by those who actually have least property, freedom, and liberty.
What's in it, I think, for the settler is that he hopes that he can put together enough of a nest egg that he'll be able to set himself up as an autonomous, independent, land-owning person or artisan, with his own shop, something like that, after the war.
Not everybody who was fighting against the crown was aiming for the crown exactly. For instance, we think of Ethan Allen and the Green Mountain Boys as these great patriots. But Ethan Allen and the Green Mountain Boys, they were actually fighting against New York. Benning Wentworth, who had been the governor of New Hampshire, had taken advantage of some confusion in the boundary lines between New Hampshire and the colony of New York to sign off land deeds, all of which made him rich, none of which were rooted in any legal basis whatsoever. And it took years to adjudicate this, and finally the Lords of Trade in 1774 said, no, New York owns this land, none of these claims is valid. But there were already a lot of people sitting on that land, including the Green Mountain Boys. So they joined up with the revolutionary movement. They made a deal, in effect, with the Continental Congress that they would throw the weight of their services to the patriotic cause. And then when everything got sorted out, their land claims would be validated.
During the first year of fighting, British forces attempt to crush each outbreak of rebellion as it occurs. After British withdrawal from Concord and Lexington, American forces attack the army of General Gage in Boston.
When they occupy Breed's Hill, confused by many people with nearby Bunker Hill, so it's the high ground overlooking Boston, and if you brought artillery up there, you could command Boston. Therefore, the British decide that they've got to drive them out. And so basically they land and conduct a frontal assault on this hill and take several assaults up the hill before the colonists run out of ammunition, and then they start to flee. But the British lose over 1,000 men that day, which was a significant proportion of their army in North America, and it's also the last stupid frontal assault the British make in the American Revolution.
British troops evacuate the Boston area and prepare to regroup, their forces now under the command of General Howe.
And the way I read his campaign in New York in 1776 is that he first arrives, he tries to negotiate with a committee from Congress. Well, Congress had just declared independence, and so they said, well, we will only talk with you if you recognize us as delegates of the United States of America. And he said, sorry, I can't do that. He then invades Long Island, wins a big victory over Washington at Brooklyn Heights. Washington flees in disarray to Manhattan, and then ultimately flees north of New York City. But at almost every point where Howe achieves something, he then stops and tries to negotiate.
They could have wiped out the American army, but they didn't. And I think one of the main reasons is what William Howe, who was the commander-in-chief of the army, thought this war was. It was not a war to wipe out the population. It was not to scourge the land. It was to break up these pockets of resistance. And that is a misunderstanding of what Washington was able to create out of the American army.
The Continental Army was certainly not nearly as professional or as well trained as the British Army. Nonetheless, the British forces were operating at an enormous distance from their home base. The leaders of the British Army often miscalculated, often underestimated the distances they were traveling, the enormous logistical challenges confronted by the portion of the North American continent that they were operating in. The leadership and determination of George Washington was also instrumental. It was very difficult for the British Army to establish any kind of final decisive victory.
And the reason for this, I think, is partly, of course, that Washington, in superb fashion, kept a scattered army together. I mean, that is a miracle that he ever did this. There was hardly an army at all. But he, first of all, built it up against a lot of resistance and kept it intact under extremely adverse circumstances.
Washington was such a powerful and important figure. The sense of probity, of dignity, of gravity, of trustworthiness, of kind of stability, all of these qualities, which were by no means unstudied in Washington. Washington was highly self-conscious about his self-presentation and took pains to cultivate a certain kind of image. But it was exactly the image that was needed, and it was an image grounded in reality. It was not just spin.
But the main thing, I think, given the fact that he had that ability, was that they continued to think that they were dealing not with a national army and not with an army that had deep ideological resources behind it that could keep them together under bad situations. They continued to think they were dealing with gangs of rioters. Well, the result of that is that they won every battle from Bunker Hill until Trenton, but they stopped.
The war was going badly. It disrupted daily lives. It killed, mostly through disease and corollary damage. It killed many Americans, disrupted families, and there was widespread demoralization after the early victories. The deteriorating economy was reflected in vast inflation and resulting social dislocations.
To me, this is epitomized in Philadelphia by an exchange of letters between Benjamin Franklin in Paris and his daughter, Sally Bache, who was in Philadelphia, who was driven out by the British when they came and took over Philadelphia. And she wrote to her father in Paris and asked for some linen and some feathers. And he wrote back to her the most caustic letter. I am horrified to receive a letter from you asking for finery during the war. It is almost as if someone had put salt on my strawberries. The taste is so wrong. And she pulled her socks up and wrote back to him and said, I have been driven from pillar to post. My patience, like my linen, is all wore out. And I think that shows, in a very understated way, the suffering that people experienced here. In some communities, there was not enough to eat. There were populations, particularly of women, when the husbands had gone off to war, who were struggling and having to make do with very little.
Thousands of people by November 1776 are taking the King's Oath in both New York and New Jersey. And with this record, would the American army even survive? Washington is really gloomy going into December 76, and he does believe that he's got to come up with something which will restore morale. And in part, it's a recruiting device. He hopes that he can persuade some of these few thousand men who are still with him to re-enlist. So he does arrange to attack Trenton, which was garrisoned by a Hessian regiment. These are the German mercenaries. And he arranges to attack it around dawn on the 26th of December. And he does achieve complete surprise. With very few losses, the Americans capture this garrison, almost all of it. And then they recross the Delaware River into Pennsylvania and wait to see what else will happen.
British General Cornwallis, determined to bag the fox, patrols the Delaware River so Washington can't slip across. But Washington changes tactics.
Takes a little used road, marches up towards Princeton, where there's another British regiment as part of the garrison, and with his militia, Washington has about 5,000 men, the British have about 1,000. As one good historian of the Revolution put it, that's about the odds the Americans needed to take out a regular unit at that phase of the war. And the Battle of Princeton then becomes a running engagement from outside of town all the way to Nassau Hall, which was the central building of the College of New Jersey, which is now Princeton University. But basically that garrison is mauled, and then the British, I would say, pretty much panic. I mean, they say, my God, he's knocking off one of our garrisons after another. Meanwhile, then, the Patriot militia shows up, and they say, okay, who took the oath to George? We want to know. And you either ate humble pie, or you fled for protection of the British Army. And I think this is one of the signs that this was a revolutionary war. It's a war for hearts and minds.
Well, the American Revolution is pretty embarrassing in retrospect as a military event, but most historians have recognized that it's not the set-piece battles that matter. There are important battles, of course. Saratoga is probably the most important. The early victories at Lexington and Concord, if they can be called victories, they're not major events, but they do inspire a continent-wide enthusiasm for the war. Saratoga is most important because it leads to the French alliance. The French had been covertly supporting the Americans. Now they could do so openly. All the Americans had to do, and this is the genius of George Washington as the commander-in-chief, was not lose.
But there's no question that without the help, primarily of France, also of Spain, and the antagonism of the European powers to England, that we might well have lost the war. It was a combination of French help, American determination, and British not quite knowing how to fight over here, because it was a very different kind of war, with soldiers who would run and soldiers who would hide behind trees. It wasn't sporting, was it?
The failure of the British to crush the Continental Army in the mid-Atlantic states, combined with the stunning American victory at Saratoga, proves to be a turning point in the war.
Several of the battles in the southern backcountry, which showed that the British had not pacified South Carolina, much less North Carolina. It takes a while to mop up operations to get rid of their garrisons, but by the time Cornwallis marches into Virginia, it's not at all clear that he really knew what he was doing or how to win this war. And I suppose the big question was whether the United States could continue this fight long enough for the British to give up without doing permanent damage to colonial society itself.
The victory at Yorktown is not just an American triumph. It is a French-American victory.
I think it's the only time in British history that they surrendered two armies to a single enemy in the course of a war. But it also marked just temporary, but French naval supremacy in the Chesapeake, which is what made the victory possible. And while the British are still willing to fight for things like protecting Gibraltar against the Spanish and other campaigns in the West Indies, on the whole they just stand on the defensive in North America after Yorktown. And once North's government falls a few months later, in March 1782, it's clear that any new ministry that the king can name is going to make peace with the colonies, and colonies won't accept peace except on the grounds of independence.
Looking back, how could a small ragtag army outlast the 18th century's most formidable military power?
And I think one of the important reasons, aside from Washington's skill, aside from that, I think one of the very important reasons is they misunderstood what they were facing. And they continued to think that their purpose was to break up these pockets of resistance, scatter them, then go on to the next one, scatter that, and then go on to the next one, until finally the population would give up. But that was a failing policy.
So it was hanging in there was the secret to American success. And then really the important point to keep in mind is that the American Revolution is a broader war that includes the European powers. And the settlement of Paris in 1783 was part of a worldwide settlement. Of course, it was only temporary, and it gave way eventually to the French Revolution and a further round of wars. What I'd like to tell my students is that they have to think of the Revolution both as an extended event that takes place really from the 1760s through 1815 with the American victory in the War of 1812, but it's also a worldwide event, and the American theater is only one of many theaters and often not the most important one.
Most Americans don't realize that the British were fighting in 5 theaters of war in the 1770s, and they only lost one of them.
So the point is that the way the British thought about the kind of war they were fighting had a great deal to do with the outcome, because they did have the resources they could draw on, limited, of course, by the fact that they did not want to annihilate the Americans, limited by the fact that they were always looking over their shoulder to see whether France was about to jump in. And there were other limiting factors, including, by the way, a very powerful opposition in Parliament.
It's one thing to subdue the West Indies. It's one thing to send people into Egypt or India. Sending British troops to shoot British Americans had an entirely different valence to it, and not a welcome one.
The increasingly active support of other European powers was also very important. It's difficult to imagine the Americans having won the war without the financial existence and also naval assistance of other European countries who increasingly come on board, not so much out of love for America as dislike for Britain.
And it turned out everybody if you like, overestimated the importance of the colonies to British prosperity. They were important, but what the British discovered after independence is that they can, just because they've got the best merchants in the world, and the most ships and things like that. So they are able to get many of the benefits of the American connection without the need to defend America. So you might say both sides ultimately prosper a lot out of the separation.
And the question at the end of the day is, how can any government rule legitimately or govern legitimately? And this was a problem the British hadn't thought through effectively.
It may not have been much of a war, but the colonists now hold the destiny of this young, untried nation in their own hands. The question is, what to do with it? Unfinished Nation is a 52-part American history series. For more information about this program and accompanying materials, call 1-800-576-2988 or visit us online at www.intelecom.org.